I've always been a bit slower to react than others, and Jackson doesn't really like me. But he has to look after me because my parents told him to. They trust him as my boyfriend. One day, Jackson got the wrong idea and thought I had hurt his younger sister. To punish me, he locked me in a small, dark room. I've always been terrified of the dark, and hearing him say in a cold voice, "Michelle, even if you're a fool, you need to accept the consequences of your actions," sent shivers down my spine. That moment completely broke me. The fear was so intense that I ended up losing my memory. When I finally woke up, the first person I saw was John Jackson's older brother sitting by my bedside. I fell for him instantly. Jackson, on the other hand, was in a panic. He knelt halfway in front of me and said, "Please, think carefully. I'm your boyfriend." But his words didn't mean much to me anymore. Later, I stood at the entrance of the school building, staring blankly at Jackson and his sister, Lolita, who seemed so close. I couldn't say when it started, but Jackson had been paying more and more attention to her. It didn't seem like brotherly affection, but I couldn't focus on that. I ran over to Jackson and tugged at his sleeve. Lolita, standing next to him, sneered. "Jackson, your girlfriend is here again." Jackson gently pulled his arm away. "What is it?" he asked flatly. I pointed at a big German shepherd nearby that wasn't on a leash. "Jackson, I'm scared," I said. He knew I had been attacked by a large dog as a child and still had a deep fear of them. But he brushed me off with an indifferent tone. "Michelle, this is a school. Stop making a scene in public," he said. His coldness confused me. When the dog suddenly growled and charged toward us, I froze. My shoulders shook, and I couldn't stop trembling. As it got closer, I panicked and called out, "Jackson!" Before I knew it, Jackson had grabbed me and pulled me to the ground to shield me. I felt a sharp pain in my knee as it hit a stone. Nearby, Lolita had also fallen and was screaming. Jackson quickly got up and ran to her, pushing the dog away and gathering her into his arms. "Don't be scared," he said softly. He checked her for injuries, but there didn't seem to be any. Still, she clung to him, trembling. "Jackson, I feel sore everywhere," Lolita murmured. His face turned serious as he lifted her into his arms. I struggled to stand and called after him, "Jackson." He interrupted me coldly. "I know you're hurt, but go to the clinic and get it treated yourself. Lolita might have been bitten, and I need to take her for a rabies shot." I looked at my bleeding knee, barely able to walk, but he wasn't listening anymore. Before I could say another word, he snapped, "If you hadn't been staring at the dog and provoking it, none of this would have happened." I stood there, stunned. His words stung more than the pain in my leg. My mom's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me, "Don't cause trouble for anyone. You are trouble." By the time I limped to the school clinic, the doctor wasn't there. So I had to go home, clean my wound, and bandage it myself. When I got home, I was surprised to see John lounging on the sofa in a hoodie. Despite being a few years older, he had a youthful, laid-back vibe that felt refreshing. "John?" I called out hesitantly. His gaze shifted to my leg, and his expression hardened. The sound of the door opening from the hallway startled me again, cutting through my thoughts. Jackson walked in, carrying Lolita in his arms, his eyebrows raising in surprise when he saw John. "John, when did you come back?" he asked. John didn't answer, just squinted at them with a faint smile. "Jackson, are you openly cheating now?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. His words hit like a wave, and the quiet sadness that had been weighing on my chest grew unbearable. Yet, in that moment, I felt a strange flicker of comfort. He was standing up for me. I lowered my head, trying to fight back the sting of tears. Lolita, still cradled in Jackson's arms, remained silent. shrinking back as if trying to disappear. Jackson, however, stayed composed, as though nothing could rattle him. Lolita twisted her ankle today because of Michelle, he explained coolly. I brought her back to take care of her for a few days. Reasonable, isn't it? With that, he walked past me with Lolita in his arms, not even acknowledging my presence. John chuckled under his breath, refusing to engage further. "Where's the first aid kit?" he asked, changing the subject. He gestured for me to sit on the sofa, carefully propping up my injured leg. As he prepared to clean my wound, I looked nervously at the array of bottles and jars. Clutching the edge of the sofa, I whispered, "John, I'm afraid of pain. Can you be gentle?" He raised an eyebrow, his expression softening. "Afraid of pain?" he asked, his tone lighter now. He worked more carefully, his hands steady and deliberate. I nodded, watching his movements closely. I feel pain more intensely than others," I admitted softly. John's voice carried a hint of concern. "Jackson doesn't seem to treat you well lately. Are you sure you want to keep going like this?" I pressed my lips together, unable to answer. What could I say? Apart from Jackson, who else did I have? He let out a quiet sigh, his expression a mix of pity and frustration. "Even if he hurts, does that not matter to you?" I flinched as he pressed the swab against my wound a little harder than before, a sharp cry escaping me. "It hurts." John immediately pulled back, his brow creasing in apology. "Sorry," he said, kneeling in front of me. He held my leg gently, blowing softly on the wound. "Is this better?" I nodded, feeling a little less tense. "What are you two doing?" Jackson's voice boomed from the top of the stairs. He looked down at us, his gaze cold and piercing. He descended quickly, his steps firm. "John, you don't need to take care of Michelle anymore. She's my girlfriend. I'll handle it." John set my leg down gently, then stood up, facing Jackson with a measured smile. "So, you're going to continue cheating on her?" The room fell silent for a moment, Jackson glaring, John unmoving. My heart sank deeper as John's words hung in the air, echoing my own unspoken thoughts. Later that night, I sat on the bed, hugging my knees. My phone was in my hands, the number I knew by heart staring back at me on the screen. It was my mother's. She had left to start a new life abroad, warning me not to call, not to disturb her. She had raised me until I turned 18, fulfilling her duty. But now, I felt like I had no right to ask anything of her. For hours, I stared at the screen, wondering what was wrong with me. Why did people leave me? Why wasn't I enough? The faint sound of an argument outside my room broke through my thoughts. Curious and uneasy, I crept toward the study where the voices were louder. "Jackson, how could you bring someone else into this house? How does that make Michelle feel?" It was my uncle, his voice filled with restrained anger. "Do you have no conscience?" Jackson's tone was icy. "Why do you always bring up her father helping our family? Are you trying to guilt trip me? I just can't stand her, okay? Is it wrong to want to date someone normal? Why don't you let my brother marry her instead?" The slap that followed was loud and sharp, cutting off the conversation. I didn't stay to hear the rest. I stumbled back to my room, dazed. I finally understood. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't lovable enough. Sitting down, I touched my head and sighed. My father used to say I just needed more time to think things through, that I was slower to react, but not a fool. Yet, tonight, I couldn't help but feel like I was exactly that, a fool, trying to hold on to people who had already let go of me. The next morning, I watched Jackson gently carry Lolita to the dining table, placing her down like she was the most delicate thing in the world. For the first time, I seriously considered leaving. The thought was fleeting but powerful, lingering in the back of my mind as I looked away. only to lock eyes with John across the room. He smirked briefly, then looked away, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, Lolita was glowing with smiles, her voice carrying a teasing tone. "Dumb sis, you're so lucky," she chirped, staying at Jackson's place and not having to lift a finger. John's fingers tapped lightly on the table, his gaze shifting to Lolita with an almost mocking curiosity. "What did you just call her?" Lolita blinked, confused but unbothered. "She's the same age as me, so isn't it fine to call hers big brother?" John leaned back slightly, his eyes sweeping over her with a sharp, dismissive air. "Who's your brother?" he asked, his tone flat but pointed. Lolita flushed, fumbling for words. Before she could respond, Jackson stepped in, his voice tight. "John, stop harassing Lolita." "Shut up," John said coldly, still maintaining his polite smile. "Do I need your permission to speak here?" Jackson's jaw tightened, his face pale with anger. But he stayed silent. John, the heir apparent, carried an air of authority that Jackson couldn't rival, even if he tried. His presence alone seemed to tilt the balance of the room. Turning back to Lolita, John smiled faintly, though his tone was anything but kind. "Well, aren't you going to apologize?" Lolita bit her lip, turning to me with wide, pleading eyes. "I'm sorry, Michelle. I didn't mean to offend you. I thought it was a cute nickname," she stammered. I stared at my plate, absently stabbing my fried egg with a fork. Without looking up, I muttered, "If you like it so much, why don't you put it on your ID and call yourself dumb?" John let out a low chuckle, his amusement softening his usually sharp features. For a moment, I felt like he was on my side. Over the next few days, John continued to check on me, even while preparing for his frequent business trips. One morning, as he changed into his crisp shirt and pants, he knelt beside me to administer my medication. Ignoring Jackson's warnings, he leaned close and said quietly, "Call me if anything happens." He hesitated, then added, "Even if nothing happens. Just call." "Thank you, John," I whispered, leaning back against the couch. He didn't leave right away. Instead, he leaned forward, locking his gaze onto mine. "What if someone bullies you?" he asked softly. "What would you do?" I hesitated, hearing my mother's voice in my mind. "Be patient. Endure if you can." But something told me that wasn't the answer John was looking for. After a long pause, I murmured, "Report it." He chuckled, nodding slightly. "That works too. But remember, the most direct way is to fight back. Nobody has the right to make you feel miserable." I carried those words with me long after he left for his week-long trip. They echoed in my mind like a lifeline. The day before he was supposed to return, Lolita stopped me on the staircase, her sweet smile carrying a bitter edge. "What will it take for you to break up with Jackson?" she asked, her tone light, but her intent razor-sharp. I ignored her, trying to walk past, but her words rooted me in place. "Please," she pressed, "just let him go. Spare him, okay?" John's advice replayed in my mind, and I turned to face her, speaking slowly and firmly. "That has nothing to do with you." Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "It does because I want to be with Jackson," she said. "Then go talk to Jackson," I reply, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. Lolita's eyes darkened, her lips curling into a smirk. "Do you really think I won't make Jackson leave you? I can make him dump you in the stupidest way." Before I could respond, she grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. The sharp pain startled me, and I instinctively pushed her away. Not hard, just enough to free myself. But she stumbled backward, her footing slipping on the stairs. Time seemed to slow as she fell. "Lolita," Jackson's voice rang out, filled with panic. He rushed to her side, checking on her quickly before calling for a driver to take her to the hospital. The mansion felt cavernous and empty after they left, with only Jackson and me remaining. He turned to face me, his expression void of any emotion. The silence between us was deafening, and I knew that whatever came next wouldn't be kind. A cold shiver ran down my back, and I stepped away without even thinking. "Jackson, it wasn't on purpose," I stammered, my voice shaky as I tried to explain. But he didn't seem to care. He backed me against the wall, his dark eyes staring straight through me like deep, endless pit. "Michelle, I'll only ask you once," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Did you push her?" "No, it's not like that," I pleaded, my words tumbling out in a panic. "It wasn't my fault, it was because..." "Did you push her?" he snapped, cutting me off. His voice rose suddenly, and I felt my face go pale. My heart was racing as I stared at the angry man in front of me, not knowing what to do. My hand instinctively went to my phone. I needed help. I needed John. But before I could do anything, Jackson grabbed my phone and smashed it against the floor with so much force it shattered into pieces. He pinned my shoulders against the wall, leaning in so close I could barely move. "John?" He let out a bitter laugh. "When did you get so close to him, Michelle?" His voice dripped with jealousy. "Just remember, I'm your boyfriend." I shook my head slightly, my voice barely a whisper. "You're not anymore, Jackson. Let me go." I pushed at his shoulder, trying to create some distance. "I don't like you. I don't want to be with you." He chuckled, like I'd just said something ridiculous. "Oh, really?" His lips curled into a faint smile. "Even if you don't want to, you'll have to deal with the consequences." Before I could react, he grabbed my arm and dragged me down the hallway. He didn't stop until we reached a storage room on the second floor. It was small, windowless, and suffocating, more like a prison cell than a room. My fear spiked as I realized what he was about to do. "Jackson, no. Please don't lock me in there," I begged, my voice breaking. "I'm scared of the dark. Please, listen to me. It was her. She made me do it." But he didn't care. Ignoring my cries, he shoved me inside and slammed the door shut. "I have to go to the hospital to see Lolita," he said coldly from the other side of the door. "When I come back, I expect you to have thought about your actions. Admit what you did and apologize to her." The room was pitch black, so dark I couldn't even see my hands in front of me. My chest felt tight, and I started to panic. Was there even enough air in here? Would I suffocate? At first, I banged on the door, screaming for help. But eventually, I gave up, collapsing onto the floor in tears. My voice grew hoarse until I couldn't scream anymore. All I could do was sit there, numb, waiting for it to end. When I finally opened my eyes, a man was standing in front of me. His shirt was a bit wrinkled, but his face, it was extraordinary. I felt an odd sense of comfort just looking at him. "Michelle," he said gently, "are you okay? Who are you?" I asked, my mind fuzzy. For some reason, I didn't feel the need to be afraid of him. He helped me sit up, his touch gentle. "I'm John," he said, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "Your fiancé." "My fiancé?" I repeated, surprised. It felt like finding a hidden treasure. My chest filled with a strange warmth, and for the first time in a while, I felt happy. But just as I was about to respond, the door burst open. Jackson stormed in, looking disheveled and frantic. "Michelle, I was wrong," he blurted out, his eyes wide with panic. I turned to John, confused. "Who is he?" John gave me a calm smile and kissed my forehead. "He's my brother, Jackson." "He doesn't matter." Jackson froze, staring at John like he'd lost his mind. "John, what are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling. But John didn't seem fazed. "If you're done, you can leave," he said firmly. Jackson's face twisted with frustration. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, suddenly, he laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, though it was cold, bitter. "So, that's how it is," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. He turned back to John, his voice sharp. "If you think you can handle this, fine. But don't come crying to me later." That night, a doctor came to check on me. "She seems to have gone through a lot," he said, shaking his head. "This may have affected her memory or even her personality." John didn't react, his face calm and steady. "She's fine," he said simply. "She's always been fine." But deep down, doubts started creeping into my mind. Was I always like this? Had something changed? And as if to confirm my fears, Jackson came back later with a girl named Lolita. As soon as she saw me, she let out a startled cry, like I was some kind of monster. Without hesitation, she ran straight into Jackson's arms, clinging to him as if her life depended on it. "Miss Teo," she whimpered, her voice trembling. "I was wrong. I didn't know you hated me so much, or that you didn't want me here. I'll leave, okay? Please don't push me again." Her hands pressed gently against Jackson's chest as she looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes, making her look fragile and pitiful. Jackson's cold gaze locked onto me like a spotlight. "Michelle," he demanded, his tone icy, "apologize to Lolita." Before John, who was sitting next to me, could say a word, I jumped in. "Evidence." The room went dead silent. Everyone froze, their eyes fixed on me. Even the air seemed heavier, like the entire villa was holding its breath. Still munching on a chip, I tilted my head and looked at Lolita. "You say I pushed you? Okay, then where's your proof?" "Do you have any?" I shrugged, my tone casual but firm. "I don't remember anything, so why should I believe you? If someone tells me tomorrow that I killed someone, does that mean I should go jump off a building to pay for it?" John was the first to react, resting his chin on his hand with a faintly amused expression. I turned to him, offering him a chip from the bag. "If you're hungry, just take one." "Staring at me like that is kind of awkward," I added, slightly embarrassed. "And if you're my boyfriend, you don't need to be shy about it." He chuckled softly, nodding as he took the chip. Lolita, on the other hand, looked completely thrown off. After a few seconds of awkward silence, she stammered, I didn't have time to record anything." I gave her a half smile, shrugging. "Well, that's too bad. No proof, no apology." Then I turned back to sharing snacks with John, ignoring the tension in the room entirely. That night, a storm rolled in, and the villa suddenly lost power. The pitch-black darkness made my chest tighten with unease. Without even bothering to put on shoes, I found myself heading to John's room. I knocked lightly, but the noise woke Jackson in the next room as well. Feeling awkward, I stood there fidgeting, clutching the hem of my nightdress. "John, I'm kind of scared of the dark. Can I sleep with you tonight?" Before John could answer, Jackson's voice snapped from behind me. "No." His tone was sharp and disapproving. "Michelle, could you at least try to have some self-respect?" I turned to him with a blank expression, annoyed. "Are you jealous?" I asked flatly. Jackson's reply was cut off when John opened the door, pulling me inside without another word. The door clicked shut behind us, blocking out Jackson's protests. "Why waste time arguing?" John muttered, his tone relaxed but firm. His dark hair fell across his forehead in messy strands, making him look more like a college student than the usually composed man I knew. A loud clap of thunder shook the villa, making me jump. Without thinking, I grabbed onto John's sleeve. "So, can I sleep with you?" I asked nervously. He gave me a quick glance. then casually pulled me toward the bed. "You're my girlfriend," he said matter-of-factly. "Why are you even asking?" I climbed into bed beside him, feeling a mix of comfort and awkwardness. Just as I was starting to relax, strange, rhythmic noises began coming from Jackson's room next door. The sounds grew louder, followed by Lolita's voice. "Jackson, slower, slower," she cried, the words painfully clear through the thin walls. My face flushed with embarrassment. "Louder, baby." Lolita's voice rang out again. "Let everyone hear." I glanced at John, expecting him to look as uncomfortable as I felt, but to my surprise, he was smiling. A soft, amused smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. I frowned. "Why do you look so entertained?" I whispered. His tone was calm, almost relieved. "Because he doesn't have a chance anymore," he said cryptically, the meaning behind his words flying over my head. Before I could ask what he meant, the noises next door got even louder. I turned my attention back to the darkness, trying to block out the sounds. John's steady breathing caught my attention, and when I glanced over, his eyes were on me dark, intense, almost predatory. "What are you doing?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. "Want," he said simply, cutting off my question. Then, without warning, he pulled me into his arms. His hands, long and elegant like a pianist's, rested lightly on my back as his lips brushed against my ear. The soft, feather-like kiss sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He smirked, his voice low and teasing. "So you want to?" I nodded silently, wrapping my arms around his neck. But instead of continuing, he stopped. His eyes softened, and he leaned back. "What's wrong?" I whispered, my voice unsteady. "Nothing," he replied, his voice husky but distant. He closed his eyes and pulled me closer, resting his head against mine as the noise from Jackson's room finally stopped. Blushing furiously, I tried to break the tension. Do you think you could go next door and borrow a sheet?" John looked at me with a teasing smile, clearly enjoying the moment. "One sheet won't be enough," he said. With that, he got up, put on a robe, and washed his hands before knocking on the door to the next room. I snuggled under the covers and listened through the slightly open door to their conversation. I heard Jackson's cold voice. "Why is it you?" But John, in a good mood, didn't seem bothered. He simply said, "My sister-in-law asked to borrow something." Jackson sneered and replied, "I don't even know you." Haven't I made that clear enough? I rolled my eyes at the exchange. John always gave in to his younger brother, never confronting him. John was gentle and just said, "My girlfriend asked to borrow something." He then casually said, "Speak up, pumpkin." There was a pause. "3 sheets for starters," John added. After a moment, Jackson cursed under his breath and snapped, "Stop pretending, John. I know you better than that. Before you know it, you won't dare." With that, Jackson slammed the door shut with a loud bang. John returned without anything in hand but didn't seem fazed. His smile didn't change at all. He simply came back to bed, pulled me into his arms, and didn't make any moves. He seemed so relaxed. He gently stroked the back of my head and said, "I'll just buy one tomorrow." As he closed his eyes, ready to sleep, I pulled away slightly, feeling unsure. "John, don't be so selfish," I said. He looked at me, his eyes heavy, and didn't know how to respond. But his gaze softened. He pulled me back close, teasing, "Are you really that eager?" I blushed furiously. "Can you not say that?" I mumbled. John's lips curved into a playful smile. "Then should I cover my mouth?" Before I could answer, he leaned in and kissed me. I wrapped myself up in the blanket, flustered, and told him to go brush his teeth. The night felt like a blur, and I couldn't quite process everything. John and I hadn't kissed before, but my resolve to resist him didn't last. John was just too pitiful, working so hard, even pushing himself to exhaustion just to be with me a little longer. He would rush through storms just to be by my side if I was scared of the dark, even if it meant facing more pressure from Jackson, who always took advantage of him. Before John finished work one evening, I decided to knock on Jackson's door. He seemed surprised when he saw me. I caught a glimpse of Lolita leaving with a sad look in her eyes, and I awkwardly smiled. "Sorry to bother you," I said. "I'll come back when you have time." Jackson quickly replied, "I have time." He opened the door, told Lolita to leave since her ankle was still healing, but watched her leave without offering any help. Jackson seemed a bit flustered as he stammered, Do you want to eat something? Or drink something? I can buy it for you. Just come in and wait." Feeling bad for him, I decided to do something nice, since he'd been so busy lately. But Jackson's face grew serious. "Is that what you really want?" he asked. I nodded, and after a long pause, without another word, he slammed the door in my face. "Don't bother me if it's nothing," he said sharply. I was frustrated and kicked his door before walking away. Jackson's bad mood lingered through the night. At dinner, John looked a bit tired, and I couldn't help but feel for him. I rested my chin on my hand, watching him, while Jackson scoffed. "Bro, if you're so tired, why not hand over the company to me?" John rubbed his temples and looked up slowly. Jackson leaned back in his chair, making his intentions clear. "Either give me back what should have been mine, or give me 2/3 of the shares," he said. He already held part of the shares, and with John's 2/3, he would become the largest shareholder. His plan was obvious. Lolita, sitting next to him, looked at me nervously and asked, "Then what am I?" Jackson laughed, playing with his food. "Did I ever say you were my girlfriend? Can't I just give you money if you need it?" "Don't make such a fuss." I watched them, pretending not to be too obvious as I stole a glance. I thought for sure Lolita would lose it right then and there, ready for some drama to unfold at the dinner table. She just lowered her head, on the verge of tears, with drops falling into her plate, not saying a word. Jackson, still furious, turned his anger on John again. "What do you think, John? I know you won't give up your inheritance rights, so just give me what's rightfully mine. I just want it." He was getting impatient, practically pleading. I didn't understand what game he was playing, but it made me really mad. I jabbed my chopsticks into the plate in front of me and shot John a look. "Is your little brother's brain not fully developed? Or is it completely underdeveloped? How else can he beg so shamelessly?" John just pursed his lips and stayed quiet, not saying a word. Jackson suddenly lost it. He kicked his chair away and stood up, smashing all the tableware onto the floor. "You remember nothing, and yet you still won't shut up." He glared at me with red eyes, a mix of anger and hurt. "Michelle, don't be so biased. Do you only realize how good he was to you after you lost your memory? Let me make it clear before you lost your memory." John interrupted him, cutting him off. I turned to look at John and noticed a deep, long wound on his forearm, blood oozing out. I quickly bent down to hold his arm, my voice shaking with worry. "How did this happen? Let me take you back to the room to take care of it," John calmly replied, when Jackson smashed the bowl earlier. A glass shard cut me. Jackson couldn't believe it. "John, what the hell are you talking about?" I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a chopstick and threw it at him. "What craziness are you spouting? You think he injured himself on purpose?" John didn't even react to the wound, almost like he wasn't feeling any pain. Meanwhile, Jackson's eyes were full of anger, staring at me, but he didn't say anything more. Later, when I was bandaging John's arm, he suddenly started crying quietly. "What's wrong?" I asked. looking at him in confusion. He gently raised my chin with one hand, and I shook my head while cutting the gauze. John wiped the tears from my eyes and leaned in to kiss me. "Why are you crying?" I kept my head down, speaking with a slight sniffle. "Jackson always bullies you. Let's move out, okay?" John smiled softly. "Okay," I continued. "Don't spoil him so much. You don't owe him anything." His kiss stopped, as if he'd been struck by some thought. There was an emotion in his eyes that I didn't fully understand. I could tell he felt guilty about something with Jackson. But before I could ask, John casually changed the subject. "What about showering tonight?" I hesitated before responding, unsure of what to say. John nodded and said, "It's fine. I can have Jackson help me." But I quickly stepped in front of him. "He might hurt you," I said, taking a deep breath. "I'll help you." John looked at me apologetically. Sorry for the trouble. In the bathroom, the tub was full of steaming water, the air hot and humid. As I stood near John, I nervously tried to untie his tie, feeling his eyes on me. He leaned over and kissed my earlobe softly, his voice low. "Hurry up, Michelle." I felt trapped, his gaze intense, and I struggled with the buttons on his shirt. "I'll go get Jackson to help you." "Is that okay?" John chuckled, his voice husky. "Too late," he said, teasing me. I'm starting to wonder if I'm in a sauna. Before I could say anything, he had already lifted me and carried me into the bathtub. All my discomfort and embarrassment vanished when I saw the blood-soaked bandage on his arm. I quickly pushed his shoulders, urging him to get out. "John, you need to get out." He raised an eyebrow, unfazed, clearly enjoying the moment. Frustrated and embarrassed, I was about to say more, but in the next instant, he kissed me. "Give me some response, Michelle," he coaxed. Caught by the pleading look in his eyes, my heart softened. Eventually, I closed my eyes, wrapping my arms around him, letting myself fall into the moment. Early the next morning, I started reaching out to the moving company. By noon, Jackson saw the big truck parked outside. His face darkened as he looked at me. "Are you guys moving out?" he asked. I casually nodded, glancing past him to find John in the room. Jackson's expression changed, his eyes narrowing, and he grabbed my arm. He pulled me in front of him, his gaze landing on the red mark on my collarbone. "Did you sleep with him?" I yanked my arm away. "It's none of your business. Let me go." His grip tightened, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. His words were cold, almost mechanical, as he said, "I am your boyfriend, Michelle." I stared at him in shock, my eyes wide in disbelief. Almost immediately, the bedroom door behind me opened without a sound. I knew John was standing there. Jackson's gaze shifted from me to John, his eyes full of challenge. Jackson laid it all out for me, his feelings, his jealousy, and his anger. He described himself as someone who cared for me, but it felt nothing like the person who had been good to me, who had sacrificed for me, and who was upset when I wasn't by his side. It took me a moment to process everything he said. Finally, I managed to pull my arm free from Jackson's grip and walked over to John, locking eyes with him. Jackson scoffed. "So he deceived you, took my place, and shamelessly touched you." John remained calm, his expression unchanged, but I could feel the tension beneath his composed demeanor. I reached for his hand. "John, can you tell me about the time before I lost my memory?" He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I did deceive you." I nodded, then asked, "How did we get along before I lost my memory? And how did you see the way Jackson and I interacted?" A vulnerable look crossed his eyes as he started to explain his perspective of things. After a while, John concluded, "I don't regret deceiving you. The moment you woke up, I would make the same choice again." Jackson snorted from behind us, but I held John's hand firmly and smiled. If given another chance, let's not go back to when I lost my memory. Let's go back to the day I was brought home, and you were the first to hold my hand, before Jackson. It would save us from a lot of detours. John embraced me, and I noticed his eyes were red, though he tried to hide it. I pretended not to see it, focusing on the moment. Later, Jackson confronted me, asking why I ultimately chose John. I thought for a moment before answering simply, because he likes me, and he's always been good to me. I had heard my aunt speak highly of John before. He has always been consistent with you, she'd said. Now, I understood what she meant. He liked me, always had, and it had never changed, even with my memory loss. Jackson's voice was rough when he responded. I like you too, Michelle. I didn't like you before, or I wouldn't have let you stay by my side for so long. I just didn't realize it sooner. But that wasn't true. Jackson had always been unwilling. He was unwilling then to be stuck with someone he found boring for life. And now, after I had regained my sanity and didn't want him anymore, he didn't want to let go. I didn't have the energy to argue with him. I just stared at him with no expression and said, "But you weren't good to me. How else would I end up locked in a storage room, losing my mind?" Jackson bit his lip and stayed silent. Without saying another word, he let me and John leave. As my memories slowly came back, I remembered a chaotic night at John's house. Lolita was pregnant with Jackson's child. It was the night when John and I were forced to listen to them being intimate. Jackson hadn't refused John on purpose. He just couldn't. When Lolita found out about the pregnancy, she waited until the 4th month to show up, too far along for an abortion. She had everything planned out, and when John and I arrived, she even threw insults at me. If it weren't for you pushing me, I wouldn't have stayed at their house for so long, nor would I have gotten tangled up with Jackson, John said, a cold sneer on his face as he ordered the bodyguards outside to escort Lolita out. I stopped him, then nodded in agreement. I remember now. I did push you, I said. Everyone turned to look at me as I slowly revealed how Lolita had scratched me with her nails. She couldn't hide her panic. The sincerity in John's voice resonated deeply within me. His words were a promise, a reassurance that despite the uncertainty of life and the challenges that might arise, he would always be there. I couldn't help but smile at the thought of it. As we stood there on that dark, quiet road, it felt like time had slowed down. Everything around us was shrouded in darkness, but in his presence, there was a warmth and clarity. His commitment to me was something I never thought I'd find, especially after everything I had been through. I gazed at him, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude and love. "I'm glad it's you," I whispered, my fingers tightening around his hand. "I'm so lucky to have you in my life." John's eyes softened as he looked down at me, his expression gentle but firm. "And I'm lucky to have you too, Michelle. You've taught me so much about love, patience, and what really matters." There was a brief silence between us as we stood there, simply holding each other's gaze, letting the world fade away. It felt like a promise that would never break. "I'll always be by your side," John added quietly, his hand brushing against my cheek. "No matter what happens, no matter how tough things get, we'll face it together." I nodded, my heart full. In that moment, all the doubts, the fears, and the past seemed insignificant. It was just us, and that was all that mattered. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," I said, my voice steady. "As long as you're with me, I can handle anything." John leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a soft, meaningful kiss. We didn't need words to express how we felt. Everything was clear in that simple gesture. The world outside might have been uncertain and unpredictable, but in each other, we had found something constant, something worth holding on to. With John by my side, I knew we could face anything that came our way. And that thought filled me with a peace I had never known before. Together, I whispered, as we began walking hand in hand into the future, ready to face whatever came next, knowing we had each other.